The wet crack of a fist against flesh, then silence, then the slow drip of blood on marble. Vivian Ashford lay crumpled at the bottom of her mansion's grand staircase, 7 months pregnant, her phone 3 feet away, showing an unsent text to her mother. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Preston. I'm scar—" She never finished that word. Her billionaire CEO husband stood above her, breathing hard. His wedding ring split from the force of his final blow.
Yes.
He stared at his unconscious wife for a long moment.
I'm certain it was Mr. Preston.
Then he straightened his
She's
tie,
absolutely
stepped over
perfect,
her body,
Vivian.
walked to his office, and poured
A
himself
true
a scotch.
gift from above.
It took him 45 minutes to call 911. Preston Ashford believed his money made him untouchable. He believed his connections would make this disappear. He believed Vivian's quiet, retired parents, an accountant, and a school teacher were powerless to stop him. He was catastrophically wrong, because Malcolm Mercer wasn't really an accountant. He was a former CIA Deputy Director of Operations. And Catherine Mercer wasn't just a school teacher. She was a federal prosecutor who had put away crime bosses and corrupt senators. What happens when a monster attacks the daughter of two people who have spent their entire lives destroying monsters? Stay until the end, because the revenge that unfolds will leave you breathless. And the lesson it teaches might just save your life. The lesson and value. This story carries a powerful message for every woman who has ever felt trapped, afraid, or alone in a relationship that slowly turned into a prison. The truth is this: staying in abuse is not weakness. It is survival. And leaving, when you finally find the courage, is not admitting failure. It is reclaiming your life. Vivian's journey reminds us that monsters hide behind charming smiles and expensive suits. They isolate us. They make us doubt ourselves. They convince us that we deserve the pain. But here is what they don't want you to know. The prison door was unlocked the whole time. You just need to see it. You just need someone to believe you. You just need one moment of clarity to walk through. If this story resonates with you, if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it. Your share might be the wake-up call that saves a life. The wet crack of a fist against flesh, then silence, then the slow drip of blood on marble. Those were the sounds that ended Vivian Mercer Ashford's old life. The life where she smiled for cameras, the life where she made excuses, the life where she believed tomorrow would be different. She lay crumpled at the bottom of the grand staircase in the Ashford mansion. 7 months pregnant, her phone had landed 3 feet away, screen cracked, showing an unsent text message to her mother. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Preston. I'm scar—" She never finished that word. Scared. She had been so scared for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. Preston stood above her on the landing, breathing hard. His wedding ring had split from the force of his final blow. Blood, her blood, dripped from his knuckles onto the Persian runner that his mother had imported from Tehran. For a long moment, he stared at his unconscious wife, at her broken body, at the curve of her belly where his daughter grew. Then he straightened his tie. He stepped over her body. He walked to his home office and poured himself a scotch. It took him 45 minutes to call 911, 45 minutes to construct his story, 45 minutes to practice the tremor in his voice. She fell down the stairs. Her pregnancy made her clumsy. "I found her like this. Please hurry. Please help my wife." The paramedics arrived at 11:23 at night. Two EMTs rushed through the front door that the housekeeper had left unlocked before fleeing to her quarters. Marcus Chen was 26 years old and had been an EMT for 4 years. He had seen car accidents. He had seen bar fights. He had seen the aftermath of violence more times than he could count. He knew immediately that Vivian Ashford had not fallen down the stairs. The bruise patterns were wrong. Falls created specific injuries, broken wrists from trying to catch yourself, contusions on one side of the body, trauma consistent with tumbling. Vivian's injuries told a different story. Defensive wounds on her forearms, knuckle-shaped bruises across her cheekbone, her orbital bone fractured from a direct blow, not an impact with stairs, and beneath the fresh purple marks, older bruises in yellow and green, injuries in various stages of healing. This woman had been beaten, not just tonight, for months, maybe years. Marcus looked at Preston Ashford, who stood in the doorway of his study with a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The man's face was arranged in an expression of concern. His voice shook with practiced emotion, but his eyes were calm, calculating. The eyes of someone watching to see if his performance was convincing. Marcus pulled out his phone and began photographing everything, every bruise, every mark, every piece of evidence that told the truth Preston Ashford was trying to bury. "Is that really necessary?" Preston asked. His voice had an edge beneath the grief. She fell. "I told you what happened. Standard procedure, sir," Marcus replied. He kept his voice neutral. He kept photographing. The ambulance screamed through the night towards St. Catherine's Hospital. In the back, Marcus worked to stabilize Vivian while his partner drove. Her blood pressure was dropping. The baby's heart rate was erratic. Both of them were dying. He called ahead to the emergency room. 32-year-old female, 7 months pregnant, severe head trauma, multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding. Alert obstetrics and neurology. This is a priority one. He did not say what he suspected. Not over the radio, not where lawyers could subpoena the recordings. But when Dr. Rebecca Holloway met the ambulance at the emergency bay doors, Marcus pulled her aside. "Doc, I've been doing this job for 4 years. That woman didn't fall down any stairs. Someone beat her half to death. And from the older bruises, it wasn't the first time." Dr. Holloway looked at the gurney. Being rushed inside. She had been Vivian's obstetrician for 6 months. She had seen the accidents, the excuses, the way Vivian flinched when Preston touched her shoulder during appointments. She had suspected. She had never been able to prove it. Now she didn't need proof. The truth was written across her patient's broken body. "Get me copies of those photos," she said. "And Marcus, thank you for paying attention." Inside the trauma bay, organized chaos erupted around Vivian's unconscious form. Nurses cut away her silk blouse. Monitors beeped and alarmed. Doctors shouted orders in the clipped shorthand of medical emergencies. "Her brain is swelling," the neurologist announced. "We need to relieve the pressure now or we lose her." "The baby's in distress," Dr. Holloway added. "Decelerations on the monitor. We may need to deliver tonight. She's only 31 weeks, I know. But if the mother dies, the baby dies too." 200 miles away in Westbrook, a quiet suburb with tree-lined streets and houses that had been paid off decades ago, a phone rang at 11:47 at night. Malcolm Mercer answered on the second ring. 64 years old, he had the weathered calm of a man who had spent 30 years answering phones that brought only bad news. His hand was steady. His voice was even. "This is Malcolm Mercer." "Mr. Mercer, this is St. Catherine's Hospital in the city. Your daughter, Vivian, has been admitted in critical condition. You should come immediately." Malcolm did not ask questions. He did not waste time on details that would become clear soon enough. He simply said, "We're on our way." He hung up and walked to the bedroom where his wife, Catherine, was already awake, sitting up in bed, watching him with eyes that had seen too much in 62 years to pretend everything was fine. "It's Vivian," he said. Catherine's face went very still. Not shocked, not tearful, something colder, something that anyone who had faced her in a courtroom would have recognized immediately. "How bad?" she asked. Critical, both her and the baby. Catherine was already reaching for her phone. I'll call Judge Hendricks. Have him put a hold on any sealed records requests from the Ashford family attorneys. Malcolm paused in the doorway. You think? I've thought it for 2 years. She stopped packing, her hands frozen over a half-folded shirt. I just couldn't prove it. Her voice cracked, just barely. I couldn't prove it, and now our daughter might die. In the pale light of their bedroom, Catherine Mercer folded the same shirt 3 times without noticing, unfolded it, folded it again. Her hands were shaking, hands that had remained steady, while cross-examining murderers, while arguing before the Supreme Court, while putting away some of the most dangerous men in the country. Malcolm crossed the room and took the shirt from her. He set it aside and pulled her close. We didn't know, he said. We should have. We should have seen it. We should have. Catherine. Malcolm's voice was firm but gentle. We couldn't have known what she wasn't ready to tell us. But we know now. And now we act. Catherine pulled back and looked at her husband. The retired accountant, the quiet man who did crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings and grew tomatoes in the backyard, the man whose personnel file at Langley was still classified at the highest levels. What are you going to do? She asked. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A door opening to a room that had been locked for a decade. Whatever I have to, he said, whatever it takes to keep our daughter safe and make sure the man who hurt her never hurts anyone again. They drove through the night, 200 miles of dark highway, of silence, of fear neither of them would admit to feeling. Catherine made calls from the passenger seat, her voice calm and professional, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Malcolm drove at exactly 7 miles over the speed limit, fast enough to matter, slow enough to avoid police. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was already working, already planning, already identifying assets and resources and favors owed. They arrived at St. Catherine's Hospital at 3:14 in the morning. The waiting room was quiet at that hour, populated only by the desperate and the grieving. Preston Ashford sat in the private family section, looking appropriately devastated. His shirt was rumpled. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were red, though whether from crying or from the scotch he had been drinking, Malcolm couldn't tell. When Preston saw them, he rose immediately. His face crumpled into an expression of relief. Oh, thank God you're here. It's been awful. She fell down the stairs. 1 minute she was fine, and the next, his voice broke artfully. They won't tell me anything. No one will tell me anything. Malcolm looked at his son-in-law. He looked at the split skin on Preston's knuckles, poorly concealed by a bandage. He looked at the tiny spatter of blood on Preston's collar that the dry cleaner would never be able to explain. He said nothing. He simply sat down across from Preston and waited. Catherine sat beside her husband. Preston reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Her face was a mask of maternal concern, a performance as polished as Preston's own. But her other hand was hidden in her coat pocket, typing rapidly on her phone. Preston continued talking, words spilling out about accidents and stairs and how pregnancy had made Vivian clumsy, about how he had warned her to be careful, about how he had found her at the bottom of the stairs and called 911 immediately. Malcolm noted every lie, every inconsistency, every rehearsed phrase that sounded just slightly too perfect. He had interrogated men who had done terrible things, men who believed their lies, men who had convinced themselves that their victims deserved what happened to them. He knew exactly what Preston Ashford was, but he said nothing. Not yet, because the quiet, retired accountant knew something that Preston Ashford did not. Revenge was a dish best served cold, And Malcolm Mercer had 30 years of practice keeping things cold. At 4:47 in the morning, Dr. Rebecca Holloway asked to speak with the Mercers privately. She led them to a small consultation room, closed the door, and abandoned every pretense of professional neutrality. "Your daughter didn't fall," she said. Her voice was tight with controlled fury. "She was beaten. Severely. There are injuries in various stages of healing going back months, possibly years. Her orbital bone is fractured, 3 ribs broken, 2 of them older breaks that never healed properly, defensive wounds on her forearms, bruising patterns consistent with being struck repeatedly with a closed fist." Catherine didn't flinch. "Did you document everything?" "Every single mark." Dr. Holloway met her eyes. "I've already contacted the hospital's legal team and law enforcement. The EMT who brought her in took photographs at the scene. This isn't going to disappear into a file somewhere. I won't let it." Malcolm spoke for the first time since they had arrived. "The baby? We delivered her via emergency cesarean at 1:12 this morning." Dr. Holloway's voice softened slightly. "She's in the NICU, 3 pounds, 2 ounces, 31 weeks gestation. She's fighting. And Vivian? In surgery now. There's swelling in her brain. The neurologist is working to relieve the pressure." Dr. Holloway hesitated. "I won't lie to you. It's serious. We don't know yet if she'll wake up, or what condition she'll be in if she does." Catherine absorbed this information with the same stillness she had shown in the bedroom. Then she nodded once and asked, "What do you need from us? For now? Just be here when she wakes up, if she wakes up." "She's going to need her parents. She's going to need more than that," Malcolm said quietly. "She's going to need to know that she's safe, that he can never touch her again." Holloway looked at this quiet man, with his gray hair and his reading glasses and his cardigan sweater. She wondered what she was missing, what everyone was missing about Malcolm Mercer. "I believe you're right," she said, "and I believe you're going to make sure of it." She was more right than she knew. Detective Samuel Briggs had been on the force for 27 years. He had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other. He had learned to compartmentalize, to distance himself, to treat crime scenes like puzzles rather than tragedies. But something about the Ashford case made his skin crawl. He arrived at St. Catherine's Hospital at 6:15 in the morning, responding to the call from Dr. Holloway. The Ashford name had already triggered a cascade of phone calls. The police chief to the captain to the lieutenant to Briggs. "Handle this carefully," the lieutenant had said. "The Ashfords built 3 hospitals in this city. They employ 4,000 people. They donate to the Police Benevolent Fund every year. Handle this carefully." Briggs understood what that meant. It meant tread lightly. It meant don't make waves. It meant remember who signs the checks. He was tired of what it meant. Marcus Chen, the young EMT, met him in the hospital lobby with a manila envelope full of photographs. The kid's hands were steady, but his jaw was tight with anger. "I've been doing this job for 4 years," Marcus said. "I know what a fall looks like. That woman didn't fall." Briggs spread the photographs across the table in an empty consultation room. He saw the bruise patterns, the defensive wounds, the yellowing marks beneath the fresh purple. He saw exactly what Marcus had seen. "You documented everything," he said. "It wasn't a question. I knew someone would try to make this go away." Marcus met his eyes. "I wasn't going to let that happen." Dr. Holloway joined them with medical records going back 6 months. Emergency room visits for a sprained wrist, a bruised shoulder, a black eye that Vivian had explained away as a fall in the shower. Each incident documented, each injury photographed, a pattern that no one had connected until now. "She came to me for prenatal care," Dr. Holloway said. "She always seemed nervous when her husband was in the room. She flinched when he touched her. I asked once if everything was okay at home, and she changed the subject so fast I knew the answer. Why didn't you report it? Report what? A woman who flinched? A woman who said she was fine? Dr. Holloway's voice was bitter. She never admitted anything. She never asked for help. I couldn't force her to tell me what was happening behind closed doors. Briggs understood. He had worked domestic violence cases before, victims who protected their abusers, women who believed the apologies, wives who were more afraid of leaving than staying. The nurse who had admitted Vivian appeared in the doorway, holding a cracked phone in an evidence bag. We found this in her personal effects, the nurse said. There's a message she was trying to send. Briggs read the partial text. Mom, I need to tell you something about Preston. I'm scarred. She was trying to tell someone, the nurse said quietly. And he stopped her, Briggs replied. He looked at the assembled evidence, photographs, medical records, a half-cent cry for help. This isn't going to be easy. The Ashfords have lawyers, connections, money, doctor. Dr. Holloway straightened her spine. I don't care what they have. That woman is my patient. That baby in the NICU is my patient. I will testify to everything I've seen and documented. I will not be intimidated. Briggs almost smiled. It was rare to find people with that kind of spine. All right, let me interview the husband. Preston Ashford's reaction to being questioned told Briggs everything he needed to know. For the first several minutes, Preston maintained his performance. The worried husband, the devastated partner, the man who couldn't understand how this terrible accident had happened. Then Briggs mentioned the photographs, the documented injuries, the pattern of abuse going back months. Preston's mask slipped. Do you have any idea who I am? He demanded. His voice had dropped the tremor, the grief, the carefully constructed emotion. What remained was cold and hard. My family built 3 hospitals in the city. We employ more people than any other company in the state. You really want to make an enemy of me over my wife's clumsiness? I want the truth, Mr. Ashford. The truth? Preston laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is that my wife is pregnant and hormonal and has been falling down constantly for months. Ask anyone. Ask her doctor. Ask the staff. I have asked her doctor, and the evidence doesn't support a fall. Preston's expression shifted, became calculating. Then I want my lawyers present for any further questions. And I suggest you think very carefully about your career before you pursue this any further. Briggs looked at this man in his expensive suit, with his expensive haircut, and his expensive mansion full of expensive lies. He thought about his pension, his kids' college funds, the lieutenant's warning to handle this carefully. Then he thought about the woman upstairs, with her head cut open, and her baby fighting for life in an incubator. I'll be in touch, Mr. Ashford. The NICU was quiet at 7 in the morning. The soft beep of monitors, the whisper of ventilators, the occasional cry of an infant not yet strong enough to scream. Catherine Mercer stood at the window, looking at her granddaughter. 3 pounds, 2 ounces. Skin so thin you could see the blue veins beneath. A tube down her throat, breathing for her, because her lungs weren't ready yet. The baby didn't have a name. Vivian hadn't decided yet. She had been waiting, wanting to meet her daughter, before choosing. Now she might never meet her. Catherine pressed her palm flat against the glass. In 35 years as a federal prosecutor, she had put away men who did terrible things. Murderers, rapists, men who destroyed families without remorse. She had maintained her composure through all of it. She had believed in the system, in justice, in the idea that truth would eventually prevail. But she had never wanted someone destroyed the way she wanted Preston Ashford destroyed. Malcolm found her there an hour later. He stood beside her, looking at the tiny form in the incubator. "She's a fighter," he said. "Like her mother, like her grandmother." "Malcolm, what are we going to do?" It wasn't a question about strategy or planning. It was the desperate plea of a mother watching her child suffer, watching her grandchild struggle to survive. Malcolm was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I made a call." Catherine looked at him. "A call to whom?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "I spent 30 years working for an agency that doesn't officially exist. I did things that will never appear in any history book. I made relationships with people who have access to information that most Americans can't imagine." She waited. "I called in a favor. Langley is sending me everything they have on Theodore and Preston Ashford, every offshore account, every buried scandal, every witness they paid off, every secret they thought was safe." Catherine stared at her husband, the quiet man who did crossword puzzles, the gentle father who had taught Vivian to ride a bike. "You said you would never use those contacts again. That was before someone tried to kill our daughter." The words hung in the air between them. Before them, through the glass, their granddaughter's chest rose and fell with machine-assisted breaths. "I spent my career putting away criminals through legal channels," Catherine said slowly. "Proper evidence, fair trials, due process. And you were good at it. But this, using intelligence assets, pulling classified files, this isn't legal. No." Malcolm turned to face her. "It's not. And if you want me to stop, I will. If you want to trust the system to handle this, I'll step back and let it happen." Catherine looked at her granddaughter, at the monitors tracking vital signs that could change in an instant, at the incubator that was the only thing keeping this tiny life tethered to the world. "The system failed our daughter," she said. "The system let him hurt her for years because no one was willing to see what was happening." She turned to Malcolm. "Don't stop, whatever you have to do. Don't stop until he can never hurt anyone again." Malcolm nodded once. "Then I need to make more calls." He left her there at the window, left her watching their granddaughter breathe. 3 floors up, Vivian lay in a medically induced coma while surgeons worked to save her life. The swelling in her brain had been worse than the initial scans showed. They had to remove a section of her skull to relieve the pressure. Nina Vasquez was the night nurse assigned to Vivian's recovery room. 28 years old, she had been a nurse for 5 years. She had worked trauma before. She had seen patients in worse shape than Vivian Ashford. But something about this case haunted her. Maybe it was the pregnancy, the knowledge that this woman had been beaten while carrying a child. Maybe it was the parade of expensive lawyers who kept appearing with documents and demands. Maybe it was the way Vivian's mother had looked at her, not with grief or fear, but with a cold, determined fury that Nina recognized. The fury of someone who was done being helpless, done watching, done waiting for someone else to fix things. At 2:17 in the morning, Nina was checking Vivian's vitals when she noticed something. A flicker of movement, lips moving without sound. She leaned close, her ear inches from Vivian's mouth. The words were barely audible, shaped more than spoken. "I tried to be good enough. I tried so hard." Nina felt tears prick her eyes. She had heard similar words before, from women who blamed themselves for violence done to them, from victims who believed that if they had just been better, smarter, more obedient, the abuse would have stopped. "It wasn't your fault," Nina whispered. "Whatever happened, it wasn't your fault." Vivian didn't respond. She slipped back into the chemical darkness of the coma, leaving Nina alone with those terrible words echoing in the silence. Later that day, when Catherine Mercer came to sit with her daughter, Nina told her what she had heard. She said she tried to be good enough, Nina explained. She said she tried so hard. Catherine's hand tightened on her daughter's. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. That's what he told her, Catherine said. That's what men like him always tell their victims. That it's their fault. That if they were just good enough, the hitting would stop. She leaned close to Vivian's unconscious form. You were always good enough, sweetheart. You were always perfect. He was the one who was broken. Not you, never you. Nina left them alone, but she made a note in Vivian's chart. Patient responsive to verbal stimuli. Possible emotional trauma requiring psychological support upon waking, and she made another note that went in no official file. Watch for attempts by husband to access patient. Do not allow unsupervised visitation under any circumstances. Some things couldn't be fixed by medicine, but they could be protected by vigilance, by attention, by people who refuse to look away. Malcolm Mercer stood in the hospital parking garage, 3 levels below the surface, in a concrete alcove that no security camera could reach. His phone buzzed with incoming files, encrypted transmissions from contacts who officially no longer existed, information that would never see the inside of a courtroom but would reshape the battlefield entirely. The Ashford family had secrets. Theodore Ashford, Preston's father, had built his real estate empire on corruption, bribing inspectors, intimidating competitors, burying evidence of construction defects that had cost lives. Preston had learned at his father's knee how to make problems disappear, but the Ashfords had never faced an enemy like Malcolm Mercer. For 30 years, Malcolm had operated in a world where information was currency and leverage was power. He had toppled regimes. He had exposed operations. He had turned assets and handled defections and done things that would never appear in any official history. He was retired now, had been for a decade, but the contacts remained, the favors owed, the debts never paid. He began making calls. Within 48 hours, Ashford Development Corporation faced unexpected regulatory scrutiny. Building inspections that had been waived for years were suddenly scheduled. Environmental reviews that had been fast-tracked were reopened. Contracts that had seemed secure were questioned. 3 major investors received anonymous packages containing evidence of financial improprieties, not enough to prove anything in court, just enough to make them nervous, just enough to make them reconsider their relationships with the Ashford family. A journalist at the Washington Post received a tip about Preston's history with women. The details were vague, names withheld, specifics blurred, but the pattern was clear. This was not the first woman Preston Ashford had hurt. There had been others before Vivian, others who had been paid to stay silent, others who might be willing to talk. Malcolm watched the dominoes begin to align. He was patient. He was methodical. He had all the time in the world. And Preston Ashford, who had never faced an opponent he couldn't buy or intimidate, had no idea what was coming. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't play in order. It doesn't respect chronology or logic or the linear progression of time. It floods in fragments, a smell, a sound, a flash of color that unlocks a door you didn't know was closed. In her medically induced coma, Vivian Mercer Ashford dreamed. She dreamed of a charity gala 2.5 years ago. Crystal chandeliers and champagne towers, and a string quartet playing something classical that she couldn't name. She had been there representing her nonprofit, trying to raise awareness for domestic violence victims. The irony would have been painful if she had been conscious enough to appreciate it. She remembered laughing at something her colleague Denise said, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind of laugh she would forget how to make in the years to come. And she remembered the moment she felt eyes on her, the moment she turned and saw Preston Ashford across the crowded room. He was beautiful. That was her first thought. Dark hair, strong jaw, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. He wore his tuxedo like it had been made for him, which it probably had. Everything about him screamed old money, effortless success, the kind of life she had only seen in movies. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not a polite social smile, something warmer, something that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. She would later learn that this was his gift, making women feel seen, chosen, special. It was the hook that drew them in. The first step in a pattern he had perfected over years of practice. But that night, she didn't know. That night, she was just Vivian Mercer, 30 years old, devoted to her work, lonely in a way she didn't like to admit. And when Preston Ashford introduced himself, she felt something she had never felt before. Possibility. The courtship was a whirlwind. Private dinners at restaurants with month-long waiting lists. Weekend trips to Paris, to London, to a private island in the Caribbean. Flowers delivered to her office every day until her colleagues joked that she was running a botanical garden. He texted constantly, called every night, showed up at her events with a smile and a compliment, and an intensity that made her feel drunk without alcohol. She would later understand the name for this behavior. Love bombing. The deliberate overwhelming of a partner with attention and affection to create dependency and gratitude. But at the time, she just thought she had found love. He made me feel like I was the only woman in the world, she would later tell her therapist. I didn't realize until much later that he wanted me to feel like I was the only woman in his world, like I didn't exist outside of it. The isolation began subtly. Small comments that seemed like concern, questions that seemed like interest. Your friend Denise seemed really critical of you tonight. I'm just worried she doesn't have your best interest at heart. Your boss is asking a lot of you. Maybe you don't need to work so hard. I can take care of both of us. Your apartment is so small. Why don't you move into my place? You'd have so much more room, and we'd get to see each other more. One by one, her connections fell away. Her friends became acquaintances, became strangers. Her work became part-time, became occasional, became nothing. Her apartment, her car, her bank account, all absorbed into Preston's world until she had nothing that was solely hers. By the time she realized what was happening, she was married, living in his mansion, dependent on his money, surrounded by his staff and his friends and his family, who all looked at her like she was an accessory, a possession, something Preston had acquired and could dispose of at will. The first hit came 8 months into the marriage. She had gone to a charity event without telling him. An honest mistake. She had mentioned it weeks ago, and he had seemed distracted, and she assumed he remembered. She came home late, buzzing with the satisfaction of a successful fundraiser, thinking of all the families she had helped that night. She found Preston waiting in the dark living room. Where the hell were you? It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, controlled, more frightening than any scream. She started to explain. The charity event, the one she had mentioned, the families who needed. The slap came so fast she didn't see it. She was on the floor before she understood what had happened. Her cheek burned. Her ear rang. She couldn't make sense of the room around her. Then he was crying, sobbing, on his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms, stroking her hair while tears streamed down his face. I was so scared something happened to you. I love you too much. I can't control it. I'm so sorry. I'll never do it again. You just can't scare me like that. She believed him. That was the terrible truth that haunted her even in dreams. She believed him. She apologized for making him worry. She promised to always let him know where she was. She accepted his tears as evidence of his love, rather than a manipulation technique as old as time. It's called the cycle of abuse, her therapist would later explain. Tension building, incident, reconciliation, calm, then tension building again. Each cycle erodes resistance, makes leaving harder, makes the victim question reality until they can't tell truth from lies. The second hit came 2 months later. The third, 3 weeks after that. Each incident was followed by tears and apologies and expensive gifts. Each calm period was shorter than the last. Each escalation, more severe. She learned to read his moods, to predict the tension building, to become small and silent and agreeable in hopes of preventing the inevitable. She learned to hide bruises with makeup, to explain injuries with clumsy lies, to smile for cameras and pretend everything was fine. She became an expert at performance, and she hated herself for it. 2 o'clock in the morning. Catherine sat alone in the hospital chapel. She didn't pray, had never been religious, but she needed somewhere quiet, somewhere the weight of the past 24 hours could settle without an audience. The chapel was small, a dozen pews, a simple altar, stained glass windows depicting scenes she didn't recognize, the kind of non-denominational, spiritual space that hospitals built for families like hers, families waiting for news, families needing comfort that medicine couldn't provide. Catherine closed her eyes and let herself remember the day they brought Vivian home from the adoption agency. Their daughter was 2 years old then. Huge brown eyes, chubby cheeks, a smile that could light up a room. She had been found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot at 3 months old. No family ever came forward to claim her. Catherine and Malcolm had tried for children for years. Fertility treatments, specialists, procedures that left Catherine exhausted and hollow. When the last attempt failed, they had grieved. They had questioned whether parenthood was meant for them. Then their caseworker called about a 2-year-old girl who needed a family. "We chose each other," Catherine had told Vivian on every birthday. "That's more powerful than blood. We chose each other." Now she wondered if that was enough. They had chosen her, loved her, protected her, and still couldn't keep her safe from a monster who smiled at charity galas. "Where did we go wrong?" Catherine whispered to the empty chapel. "What did we miss?" There was no answer. There never was, not to questions like that. The only answer was the weight of guilt that would never fully lift. In the hallway outside the surgical intensive care unit, Malcolm held a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. He hadn't taken a sip. He was thinking about a conversation with Vivian 3 years ago. A phone call on a Sunday afternoon. "Dad, I met someone. I think this might be it." The joy in her voice, the hope, the sound of his daughter finally ready to open her heart to someone new. He had been happy for her. God forgive him. He had been happy. He had welcomed Preston into their family without question, had shaken his hand at the wedding, toasted the happy couple, watched them drive off into their new life together. He should have investigated, should have dug into Preston's background the way he would have with any asset, should have trusted his instincts, which had prickled with unease from the first meeting. But Vivian had seemed so happy, and Malcolm had wanted so desperately for his daughter to find love. The coffee had grown a skin of cold cream on top. Malcolm stared at it without seeing. "I should have known," he thought. "I should have protected you." 2 floors down, in the NICU, a night shift nurse named Maria was singing softly to the Ashford baby. The song was an old lullaby, one her grandmother had sung to her in Spanish when she was small. The baby couldn't hear it, probably. The baby was fighting for each breath, struggling with lungs that weren't ready for the world. But Maria sang anyway, because sometimes the things that help most are the things we can't measure. The presence of another human being, the vibration of a voice through the air, the simple, powerful act of not being alone. "Hold on, little one," Maria whispered between verses. "Your mama needs you to hold on." Detective Samuel Briggs sat in his car outside the police station, staring at the file in his lap. He had been a detective for 22 years. He had learned to trust evidence over instinct, facts over feelings, documentation over gut reactions. The evidence in the Ashford case was compelling. Medical records, photographs, witness statements from hospital staff, a pattern of abuse that stretched back years. But evidence alone didn't win cases, not against families like the Ashfords. His phone rang. The captain. "Briggs, I need you in my office. Now." The captain's office was small and cluttered, decorated with commendations and photos from 30 years on the force. Captain Morrison was a good cop. Fair, honest, the kind of leader who actually believed in justice. But he was also political. He knew how the game was played. "Close the door," Morrison said. Briggs did. "I've been getting calls all morning about the Ashford case, the chief, the mayor's office. People I haven't heard from in years." Morrison rubbed his temples. "They want to know why we're pursuing this. Why we're making noise about an accidental fall." "It wasn't an accidental fall," Briggs said. "The evidence—" "I know what the evidence shows." Morrison cut him off. "I've seen the photos. I've read the reports. I know exactly what Preston Ashford did to his wife." "Then why are we having this conversation?" "Because knowing and proving are different things." Morrison leaned forward. "The Ashfords have lawyers, the best lawyers. They'll bury us in motions and counterclaims and expert witnesses who'll say anything for the right price. They'll drag this out for years. And when it's finally over, Preston Ashford will walk away with a slap on the wrist and a settlement that makes everyone go quiet. So we just let him get away with it?" "I didn't say that." Morrison paused. "I said we need to be smart about this. We need to build an airtight case. We need evidence that even Ashford money can't make disappear. We have evidence. We need more." Morrison slid a folder across the desk. "I ran some background on the family. Just quiet inquiries. And I found some interesting things about the parents. Vivian Ashford's adoptive parents." Briggs opened the folder. He read the first page, then the second. Then he looked up at Morrison with an expression of disbelief. Malcolm Mercer wasn't an accountant. No, he was not. He was CIA, Deputy Director of Operations before retirement. And Catherine Mercer, 30-year career as a federal prosecutor. She personally convicted the Castellano crime family, 3 corrupt senators, and a sitting federal judge. Briggs closed the folder. "So the Ashford family is about to make these people their enemies. That's what I'm saying." Morrison almost smiled. "And I don't think they understand what that means." Preston Ashford did not understand what it meant. He sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of old money, leather-bound books he had never read, oil paintings of ancestors who had built the family fortune on the backs of workers they exploited, a desk made from wood older than the country itself. His lawyers had assured him that everything was under control. The wife would recover, or she wouldn't. Either way, the narrative was set. A tragic accident, a devoted husband, a family devastated by misfortune. The Mercers were a problem, but a manageable one. Estranged relatives trying to access the Ashford fortune. That's how the story would play. That's what the media would report. That's what the judge would hear when the conservatorship motion was filed. Preston took a sip of his morning coffee and felt confident. He had been in tight spots before. His father had taught him well. Money solved problems. Lawyers smoothed edges. Power made inconvenient truths disappear. His phone rang. His attorney. "We have a problem," the attorney said. "What kind of problem?" "The conservatorship motion was denied. Judge Patterson recused himself this morning. Something about financial irregularities under review." Preston's coffee turned bitter in his mouth. Patterson was a reliable ally. Had been for years. Who's reviewing his finances? "I don't know, but it gets worse. The Regulatory Commission announced surprise inspections of our Riverside development. The EPA is reopening environmental reviews on 3 other projects. And I just got a call from a journalist at the Washington Post asking about your relationships with women before your marriage." Preston set down his coffee cup. His hand was shaking. That's not possible. It's happening. The attorney's voice was tight. Someone is coming after you. Someone with access to information that shouldn't be accessible. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Find out who. I'm trying. But whoever this is, they're good. Very good. Preston ended the call and stared at the wall of his study, at the portrait of his father that hung above the fireplace. Theodore Ashford's painted eyes seemed to judge him. You taught me to never show weakness, Preston thought. You taught me to destroy my enemies before they could destroy me. But what do you do when you can't see the enemy coming? The NICU was quiet at midnight. Malcolm stood at the window, watching his granddaughter sleep. She had gained 2 ounces. Her breathing was stronger. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. But cautiously optimistic was a long way from safe, a long way from healthy, a long way from the life she deserved. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. Another file from his contacts at Langley. More information about the Ashford family's dark history. Malcolm read the summary. Theodore Ashford had been a monster. He had beaten his wife for 30 years before she died of complications from injuries that were officially attributed to a car accident. He had abused his staff, his business partners, his competitors. He had created Preston in his own image, teaching his son that power meant never facing consequences, that women were possessions, that violence was just another tool for getting what you wanted, like father, like son. Malcolm thought about the man down the hall, the man who smiled for cameras and lied to police and beat a pregnant woman into a coma, the man who had learned cruelty from a master and perfected it through years of practice. Theodore Ashford was dying. Cancer, according to the files. Months to live, at most. He would escape justice in this world, but his son would not. Malcolm made another call, an old colleague who now worked in private intelligence. I need everything on Preston Ashford's previous relationships, women before his wife, anyone who might have complaints, anyone who might have been paid to stay silent. That's a tall order, I know. Malcolm watched his granddaughter's chest rise and fall. But I'm calling in every favor I'm owed, every asset I cultivated in 30 years. I want this man destroyed so completely that his name becomes a cautionary tale. There was silence on the other end. Then, you never talked like this when you were active. I never had a daughter in a hospital bed fighting for her life. More silence. Then, I'll see what I can find. Catherine found him there an hour later. She stood beside him at the window, watching their granddaughter sleep. You're doing something, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Is it legal? Some of it. Catherine considered this. She had spent her career within the system, following rules, trusting process, believing that justice, though slow, would eventually prevail. But the system had failed Vivian. The system had let Preston Ashford hurt her for years because no one was willing to see. No one was willing to act. No one was willing to risk their career or their comfort to protect a woman who wouldn't protect herself. Good, Catherine said. Do whatever you have to do. Malcolm looked at her, the woman he had loved for 40 years, the partner who had built a life with him, raised a daughter with him, faced every challenge with him. This might get ugly. I hope it does. Catherine's voice was cold. I hope it gets so ugly that Preston Ashford wishes he had never been born. Malcolm nodded once. Then I need to make more calls. Day 12, Vivian developed a brain bleed. The emergency alarm started at 2:47 in the morning. Nurses running, doctors shouting orders, the controlled chaos of a medical crisis unfolding at speed. Malcolm and Catherine were in the waiting room when Dr. Holloway found them. Her face told the story before her words did. There's a complication. Bleeding in her brain that wasn't there before. We need to operate immediately or we'll lose her. Catherine's knees buckled. Malcolm caught her, held her up, kept his face expressionless through sheer force of will. "Do whatever you have to do," he said. "Save our daughter." The surgery took 6 hours. For 6 hours, Malcolm and Catherine sat in the chapel, not praying. Neither of them believed in that kind of comfort. Just sitting in the silence, holding hands, waiting for news that would either save them or destroy them. At some point, Catherine broke. It started as a tremor in her shoulders, then a sound that wasn't quite a sob, more like something breaking loose from deep inside her. Then tears, the first Malcolm had seen her cry since they buried her mother 20 years ago. She was trying to leave him, Catherine said through her tears. She was trying, and we didn't know. We didn't help her. We didn't. Malcolm held her. He didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. He didn't say Vivian would be fine, because he didn't know. He just held his wife while she grieved for all the times they hadn't seen what was happening, all the times they hadn't asked the right questions, all the times they had been fooled by Preston's charm and Vivian's performance. "We'll make it right," he said finally. "Whatever happens, we'll make it right." While Vivian fought for her life in surgery, Preston launched his counterattack. His legal team filed for emergency conservatorship, claiming Vivian was incapacitated and unable to manage her affairs. They filed motions to limit the Mercers' access, claiming they were estranged relatives with financial motives. They hired a PR firm to manage the narrative. Preston gave a tearful interview to a sympathetic local news station. He wore a blue sweater that made his eyes look wet. He held a photo of Vivian from their wedding day. His voice cracked at all the right moments. "I just want my wife to wake up. I love her so much. I don't understand why her parents are trying to keep me from her side." The interview went viral. Social media filled with #JusticeForPreston. A GoFundMe appeared for his legal defense fund. Opinion pieces were written about overreaching in-laws and the dangers of rushing to judgment. The tide of public opinion turned. Suddenly, the Mercers were the villains, the couple trying to tear apart a devoted husband from his injured wife, the outsiders interfering with a family tragedy. Detective Briggs was pulled off the case. His captain called it a conflict of interest. His captain called it procedure. His captain looked him in the eye and silently apologized for something neither of them could control. The system was working exactly as Preston Ashford had paid for it to work. 3 o'clock in the morning, Catherine sat alone in the hospital cafeteria. The tables were empty. The lights buzzed overhead. The vending machines hummed their eternal mechanical hymn. Catherine stared at a cup of soup she hadn't touched. It had been sitting there long enough to form a skin on top. In 35 years, as a prosecutor, she had lost cases. She had watched guilty men walk free because of technicalities, because of witness problems, because juries made decisions she couldn't understand. She had learned to accept that justice was imperfect, that the system, for all its flaws, was better than no system at all. Now she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. Preston Ashford was going to win. He had money and lawyers and media spin and the inertia of a society that protected men like him. He was going to win, and Vivian, if she survived, would be dragged through hell trying to fight him. The divorce would be brutal. The custody battle for the baby would be worse. Years of litigation and emotional violence while Preston smiled for cameras and played the victim. Catherine had seen it before. Powerful men who destroyed their families through the legal system. Mothers who lost their children because fathers had better lawyers. Women who were ground down until they had nothing left. She wouldn't let that happen to Vivian. Malcolm found her there, staring at the congealing soup. He sat across from her. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them was comfortable, 40 years of marriage had taught them that words weren't always necessary. Finally, Catherine said, "I keep thinking about when she was little." Malcolm waited. She used to have nightmares. She'd crawl into our bed and say, "I dreamed the bad people came back for me." And I'd tell her, "No one can hurt you. Mommy and Daddy won't let them." She looked at Malcolm. Her eyes were red. We lied to her. We didn't. We lied. We promised to protect her, and we didn't. Someone hurt her for years, and we didn't see it. We didn't stop it. All our training, all our skills, all our contacts, and we couldn't protect our own daughter. Malcolm reached across the table and took her hand. "Catherine, we can't change what happened, but we can change what happens next." "How?" "With your spy contacts, with my legal connections. None of that saved her from getting beaten into a coma." "No." Malcolm's voice was quiet, but hard. "None of that saved her, but it will destroy him." He squeezed her hand. "I promise you, Catherine, Preston Ashford will lose everything. His money, his reputation, his freedom. By the time we're done, he'll be a cautionary tale that every abuser in this country thinks about before raising his hand." Catherine looked at her husband. The quiet man, the gentle father, the retired spy who had come out of retirement for the most important mission of his life. "Promise me," she said. "I promise." The surgery ended at 8:43 in the morning. Dr. Holloway found them in the chapel, still holding hands, still waiting for the verdict. "She's alive," the doctor said. The word seemed to cost her something. "She's alive. The bleeding has stopped. We relieved the pressure, but I won't lie to you. The next few days are critical. We don't know yet what kind of damage there might be. We don't know if she'll wake up, or when, or what she'll be like if she does." Catherine closed her eyes. "Thank you. I'm sorry I can't give you more certainty." Dr. Holloway looked exhausted. "Brain injuries are unpredictable. Sometimes patients surprise us. Sometimes they don't. Can we see her?" "Yes. She's being moved to the ICU now. You can sit with her." The ICU room was quiet. Monitors beeped. Machines hummed. Vivian lay motionless in the bed, her head bandaged, tubes running in and out of her body. Malcolm stood at her bedside, looking down at his daughter. "I didn't protect you," he said quietly, "but I'm going to fix that now. I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone again." He stayed there until dawn, watching, waiting, planning. 2 o'clock in the morning. Malcolm drove through the empty streets of the city. He parked outside the Ashford mansion, the house where his daughter had been beaten nearly to death. The windows were dark. Preston was inside, sleeping peacefully, confident that money and lawyers would make everything go away. Malcolm sat in his car for an hour, just watching, just thinking. In another life, he would have handled this differently. In another life, there were skills he could apply. A quiet solution that no one would ever trace. But that's not who he was anymore. That's not who Vivian had raised him to be. Yes, raised him. Because parenthood wasn't just about what you taught your children. It was about what they taught you. And Vivian had taught him that there were better ways to defeat monsters than becoming one. He drove away. There was a better path. A path that didn't just stop Preston Ashford. A path that destroyed him completely, publicly, and legally. The path would take longer, but the destination would be worth it. Day 18. The first thing Vivian became aware of was sound. Beeping monitors, a distant voice saying her name, the soft whoosh of machines keeping her alive, then pain, a deep, throbbing ache in her head that pulsed with each heartbeat. Her whole body felt heavy, wrong, disconnected from itself. She tried to open her eyes. The light was too bright. She closed them again. "Vivian?" The voice was closer now, familiar. "Vivian, can you hear me?" Nina, the nurse, the one who had been there through the dark hours, the one Vivian remembered from the edges of her coma dreams. She tried to speak. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked. The word came out as a croak. Baby? Nina's face swam into focus above her. Tears were streaming down the nurse's cheeks. She's okay. She's in the NICU. She's a fighter, just like her mama. Vivian processed this. Her daughter was alive. She was alive. They had both survived. The second question came harder, pulled up from somewhere deeper. Where's Preston? Nina's expression shifted, became careful. He's not here, right now. Don't let him near me. Vivian's voice cracked on the words. Please, don't let him near me. I won't. Nina squeezed her hand. I promise. No one is going to hurt you anymore. Catherine and Malcolm were called to Vivian's room within the hour. They had been in the hospital cafeteria, drinking their third cups of coffee, going over the latest intelligence from Malcolm's contacts. When they walked through the door and saw Vivian's eyes open, Catherine made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. Oh, baby. She crossed the room in 3 steps, gathering her daughter into a careful embrace. Oh, my baby. I was going to tell you. Vivian's voice was weak but steady. I was trying to tell you. That night, I was texting Mom when She couldn't finish. You don't have to explain anything. Catherine pulled back, holding Vivian's face in her hands. We know everything, and it's over now. He's never going to touch you again. Malcolm stood at the foot of the bed, watching. His face was calm. His eyes were not. How long? Vivian asked. You've been unconscious for 18 days. Dr. Holloway explained the surgery, the complications, the recovery ahead. You're stable now. The baby is stable, but you have a long road ahead of you. Vivian nodded slowly. She was trying to fit the pieces together. 18 days, nearly 3 weeks of her life gone, nearly 3 weeks of her daughter's life that she had missed. I want to see her, she said. I want to see my baby. Dr. Holloway exchanged a look with Catherine. Soon, when you're a little stronger. Right now, we need you to rest and recover. But she's okay? She's doing remarkably well. 33 weeks now. Gained almost a pound. She's breathing on her own, most of the time. Vivian closed her eyes. Tears leaked from the corners. I was going to leave him, she whispered. I had started planning. I was going to get out, Catherine took her hand. We know, and you still will. You're going to get out, and you're going to be free, and he's going to spend the rest of his life paying for what he did to you. There was something in her mother's voice that made Vivian look up, a hardness she had never heard before, a promise wrapped in steel. Mom, what are you doing? What we should have done years ago. Catherine's jaw was set. Protecting our daughter. Detective Briggs visited off-duty. He had been following the case, despite being pulled from it, tracking the evidence through unofficial channels, building a file that no superior officer had authorized. He sat in a chair beside Vivian's bed and asked the question directly. Mrs. Ashford, I need to ask you, do you want to press charges against your husband? Vivian looked at her parents, then at the photograph of her daughter that Nina had taped to the wall. 3 pounds, 8 ounces now, a tiny fist raised as if in defiance. Yes, her voice was stronger than it had been. I want to press charges. I want to testify. I want him to look me in the eye while I tell the world what he did. Briggs nodded. Then we'll need to work together. This won't be easy. The Ashfords have resources, connections. They'll fight dirty. I know. Vivian met his eyes. But I'm done being afraid. I'm done hiding. I'm done protecting the man who tried to kill me and my daughter. I stayed because I thought I could fix it, she said later, when Briggs had gone and only her parents remained. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting I'd made a mistake. I stayed because I was ashamed. Catherine squeezed her hand. But I'm not ashamed anymore. Vivian's voice hardened. I'm furious. 3 days later, Vivian was strong enough to be wheeled down to the NICU. Nina pushed her chair through the quiet corridors, past the hushed voices and the worried families and the endless beeping of machines that measured life and death in digital increments. The NICU was warm, dimly lit, designed to mimic the womb as much as modern medicine allowed. Nina stopped the wheelchair in front of an incubator in the corner. "Here she is," the nurse said softly. "Your daughter." Vivian looked through the plastic walls at the tiny form inside. 3 pounds, 8 ounces, still so small. Still hooked to monitors. But breathing, living, fighting. She pressed her palm against the warm plastic. "Hello, baby," she whispered. "I'm your mama. I'm so sorry it took me so long to meet you." The baby's hand twitched, tiny fingers flexing against the soft blanket. "Can I hold her?" Nina checked with the NICU nurse. Arrangements were made. Careful hands transferred the tiny bundle from incubator to mother. Vivian held her daughter for the first time. 3 pounds of impossibility, translucent skin over blue veins, eyes closed against a world she wasn't ready for, but warm, alive. Her daughter, her reason for everything that would come next. "I'm going to name you Rose," Vivian whispered, "because roses grow thorns to protect themselves, and you're going to need thorns, baby. The world is hard. Rose Catherine Mercer. A new name for a new beginning. No Ashford anywhere in it." Catherine stood at the NICU window, watching Vivian hold her granddaughter. Malcolm stood beside her. "She's going to be okay," Malcolm said. "She's going to be more than okay." Catherine's voice was fierce. "She's going to thrive. She's going to raise that baby. She's going to help other women like her. And Preston Ashford is going to spend the rest of his life knowing that he couldn't destroy her, that he tried his hardest, and she survived anyway." Malcolm looked at his wife, the prosecutor, the mother, the woman who had spent 35 years believing in systems and was now watching those systems fail. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." Catherine didn't look away from the window. "Now let's go destroy our son-in-law." The Washington Post headline landed like a bomb. CEO's History of Violence. 3 women tell their stories. The article was meticulously researched, legally vetted, and utterly devastating. 3 women Preston had dated before Vivian. Each one had experienced the same pattern. The charm offensive, the isolation, the first hit that came out of nowhere, the tears and apologies and promises to change. One woman had been paid $200,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Another had dropped charges after receiving threats to her family. The third had simply disappeared from public life, too broken to fight anymore. They were ready to talk now, ready to tell their stories, ready to watch Preston Ashford finally face consequences. Malcolm's contacts had found them. Catherine's legal connections had protected them. Together, they had given 3 women the courage to speak. Preston's PR team went into crisis mode. Damage control statements, denial of all accusations, character attacks on the women brave enough to talk. It didn't work, because when one domino falls, the others follow. Harrison Cole, Preston's CFO and best friend, was arrested for fraud on a Tuesday morning. The evidence was irrefutable. Offshore accounts, falsified records, a paper trail of corruption that stretched back 15 years. Harrison had been Preston's fixer for all of it. He knew where every body was buried. He flipped within 6 hours. In exchange for reduced charges, Harrison provided investigators with everything: financial crimes, bribery of public officials, witness tampering, and previous abuse allegations. Preston's own text messages to Harrison, casually discussing how to make problems disappear. "She's getting too independent. We need to bring her back in line. Maybe a trip to the hospital." That worked with Jennifer. That message alone would have been enough, but there was so much more. Margot Ashford Wellington, Preston's mother, was served with a subpoena on a Wednesday afternoon. Her attempts to cover up her son's violence, paying off Preston's previous girlfriends, threatening witnesses, destroying evidence, were now part of the criminal investigation. She called Preston, panicked. "I'm facing criminal charges," she shrieked. "Because of you. Because of what you did. Mother, calm down. We have lawyers." "Lawyers won't help us now." Margot's voice was breaking. "They know everything. Every payment. Every threat. Every witness we made disappear. We're going to prison, Preston. Both of us. That's not going to happen. It's already happening. I'm being told to surrender my passport." "Do you understand? I can't leave the country." Preston hung up. His hand was shaking too badly to hold the phone. Theodore Ashford, Preston's father, died on a Thursday morning. Cancer finally claimed what corruption could not. In his final hours, delirious with pain medication and the proximity of death, Theodore made a confession to his hospice nurse. "I taught him everything he knows," Theodore mumbled. "Preston. I taught him how to handle women, how to keep them in line. His wife, the first one, she was going to leave me. I couldn't let that happen. I had to teach her what happens when a woman forgets her place." The nurse recorded everything. When Theodore's heart finally stopped, she contacted Detective Briggs. He confessed, she said, to what he did to his wife, and to teaching his son to do the same thing. Briggs listened to the recording 3 times. Then he added it to the evidence file that was growing thicker by the day. The board of Ashford Development Corporation called an emergency meeting on a Friday afternoon. Preston sat at the head of the table, surrounded by men who had been his allies for 20 years, men who had profited from Ashford money, men who had looked the other way when whispers surfaced about Preston's temper, Preston's girlfriends, Preston's wife's accidents. They weren't looking away anymore. "Preston, it's over." The board chairman was 70 years old and had known Theodore since childhood. "The company can't survive this. The investigations, the lawsuits, the media attention. Our stock has dropped 40% in 2 weeks. Our partners are pulling out. Our lenders are demanding loan reviews." "This is temporary," Preston said. "When the dust settles." "The dust isn't going to settle." Another board member spoke up. "You're facing criminal charges. Your mother is facing criminal charges. Your CFO is cooperating with prosecutors. You're done, Preston. The only question is whether you take the company down with you." "What are you saying?" "We're asking for your resignation, effective immediately. If you fight us, we'll remove you by force. This is not a negotiation." Preston looked around the room at the men he had known his whole life, men who had attended his wedding, men who had golfed with his father, men who had known what kind of man he was and had never said a word. They were abandoning him now, not because of what he'd done. They had tolerated that for decades. Because of what he'd cost them: money, reputation, the comfortable anonymity of complicity. "You'll regret this," Preston said. "We already regret many things." The chairman met his eyes, but this isn't one of them. Preston's world collapsed in pieces over the following weeks. His assets were frozen pending investigation. His country club membership was revoked. His social calendar emptied as friends and colleagues suddenly became too busy to return calls. The mansion was seized as part of the fraud investigation. Proceeds of crime, the documents said. He was reduced to a hotel suite, paid for with credit cards that would soon be canceled. Alone except for the lawyers, who charged $500 an hour to deliver bad news. And then he did something stupid. He showed up at the hospital. Malcolm was in the lobby when Preston walked through the doors. The younger man looked disheveled, unshaven, red-eyed, wearing clothes that had been slept in. "I want to see my wife," Preston said. "I have rights." Malcolm stood between Preston and the elevators. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply looked at his son-in-law with the cold assessment of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating targets. "You should leave," Malcolm said. "She's still my wife. I have legal rights to see her. Your daughter is still carrying my name. My daughter. Your daughter's name is Rose Catherine Mercer." Malcolm's voice was ice. "Stim. She'll never know you existed. She'll never learn her biological father was a monster. She'll grow up loved and protected, surrounded by people who would die before letting anyone hurt her." Preston's face twisted. "You think you've won? You think your connections and your spy games have beaten me? My lawyers? Your lawyers are negotiating plea deals because they know what's coming." Malcolm stepped closer. "Let me explain something to you, Preston. I spent 30 years working for people who handle problems quietly, efficiently, permanently. I'm retired now, but I still have friends. Friends who owe me favors. Friends who can make things happen that no one ever traces back to anyone." Preston's face paled. "I'm not going to hurt you," Malcolm continued. "That would be too easy. Instead, I'm going to watch while everything you built burns to the ground. I'm going to watch while you're dragged through court, humiliated, convicted, and imprisoned. And then I'm going to watch while you rot in a cell, knowing that my daughter is happy and successful and raising her child, and that you have absolutely no power over her or anyone else ever again." Malcolm smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "So please, Preston, keep fighting, keep trying. It just makes the destruction more satisfying." Preston stared at the older man, at the quiet retiree who did crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings, at the grandfather who had seemed so harmless. He turned and left without another word. That night, Preston sat alone in his hotel room. The staff had quit, or been fired, or simply stopped showing up. The phone didn't ring. The suite felt enormous and empty. He poured scotch with shaking hands and realized for the first time in his life that he had no idea what came next. 6 months later. The courthouse was old and grand, built in an era when justice was meant to be imposing. Marble columns, high ceilings, the weight of history pressing down on everyone who entered. Vivian walked through the doors with her mother on one side and Detective Briggs on the other. She wore a simple, gray dress, no jewelry, except for a thin gold chain with a rose pendant, a gift from Nina, the nurse who had become a friend. She was terrified. She had been dreading this day for months, the moment when she would have to face Preston in public, the moment when she would have to tell her story to strangers and hope they believed her. But beneath the terror was something else, something harder, something that had been growing since she woke up in that hospital bed 18 days after her husband nearly killed her. Resolve. The courtroom was packed, journalists in the gallery, scribbling notes for tomorrow's headlines, advocates and supporters who had followed the case, curious spectators who wanted to see the wealthy CEO brought low. Preston sat at the defense table with his team of expensive lawyers. He looked different, thinner, older, the polish worn away to reveal the desperation beneath. When Vivian entered, he turned to watch her. His eyes were cold. She didn't look at him, didn't give him that satisfaction. She walked to the witness stand with her head high and her shoulders back. The prosecutor was a woman named Lisa Chen, who had been personally chosen by Catherine's contacts in the legal community. She was brilliant, relentless, and deeply committed to putting abusers behind bars. "Mrs. Mercer," she began, "please tell the court about your marriage to Preston Ashford." Vivian told her story. She told them about the charm offensive, the isolation, the first hit that came out of nowhere, the tears and apologies and promises to change. She told them about the escalation, the broken ribs that were never reported, the black eyes explained away as accidents, the constant fear that became so normal she forgot what it felt like to not be afraid. She told them about the night she almost died, the text message she was trying to send, the sound of Preston's fist against her face, the long fall down the stairs, and the darkness that followed. She spoke for 3 days. Her voice cracked sometimes. Her hands shook. But she never faltered. She never wavered. She looked at the jury and told her truth with absolute clarity. He told me no one would believe me, she said. He told me I was lucky to have him. He told me I was nothing without him. She paused. He was wrong about all of it. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records showing years of accidents that weren't accidents. Financial records showing hidden accounts and paid-off witnesses. Testimony from 8 other women Preston had abused over 2 decades. Harrison Cole took the stand and described 20 years of cover-ups. The payments to victims, the threats to their families, the casual discussions about how to handle women who got out of line. Holloway testified about the injuries she had documented, the pattern of abuse she had suspected but couldn't prove until Vivian's broken body arrived in her emergency room. Nina testified about the words Vivian had whispered in her coma. I tried to be good enough. I tried so hard. And then the prosecution played Preston's text messages, his own words, in his own voice recorded for posterity. I'll kill you if you ever try to leave me. You belong to me. The jury heard it all. Preston's defense team tried everything. Character attacks on Vivian, expert witnesses who questioned the medical evidence, allegations that the Mercers had orchestrated a conspiracy to destroy an innocent man. None of it worked. When Preston took the stand in his own defense, his mask finally shattered. The prosecutor questioned him about the text messages, about the paid-off witnesses, about the consistent pattern of violence that stretched back decades. Preston's charm evaporated. His composure cracked. He screamed at the prosecutor. He called Vivian a liar. He threatened the judge. The jury watched the monster emerge from behind the mask. They saw exactly what Vivian had lived with for 3 years. The deliberation took 4 hours. When the jury returned, the 4 women stood and faced the defendant. In the matter of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. In the matter of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. In the matter of witness tampering, we find the defendant guilty. In the matter of financial crimes, we find the defendant guilty. 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 As the verdict was read, Vivian closed her eyes. She thought of all the times she had believed him, all the times she had apologized for making him angry, all the times she had thought it was her fault. It was never my fault, she whispered. It was never my fault, Catherine heard her. She took her daughter's hand and held on tight. No, sweetheart. It never was. 4 weeks after the verdict, the courtroom was quieter for sentencing. Fewer journalists, fewer spectators. Just the people who needed to be there. Vivian had written a victim impact statement. She had spent weeks on it, trying to find words for something that words could never capture. In the end, she had kept it simple. Preston Ashford tried to kill me. She read from the witness stand. He beat me and degraded me and made me believe I deserved it. He tried to erase me from existence so completely that I would disappear and no one would ever know the truth. She looked at Preston for the first time since the trial began. He stared back at her with empty eyes. But I'm still here. My daughter is still here. And you have no power over either of us anymore. She folded her statement and stepped down. Judge Patricia Reynolds was 72 years old and had been on the bench for 30 years. She had seen every kind of case, petty theft to serial murder, white-collar fraud to violent assault. She had learned to be measured in her words and careful in her judgments. But when she looked at Preston Ashford, her face hardened. Mr. Ashford, she began, you were given every advantage in life, wealth, education, opportunity, family connections that open doors most people can't even see. You could have done anything, been anything. She paused. Instead, you chose to terrorize, abuse, and nearly murder a woman who trusted you. You used your money and your connections to silence your victims and escape accountability. You believed your wealth made you untouchable. Her voice dropped. You were wrong. The courtroom was silent. You are not a victim. You are not misunderstood. You are a violent predator who believed the rules didn't apply to you. The evidence in this case proves that you systematically abused multiple women over 2 decades, that you nearly killed your pregnant wife, and that you used your resources to cover up your crimes and intimidate witnesses. Judge Reynolds straightened her papers. This court sentences you to 25 years to life in state prison. You will not be eligible for parole for 15 years. Your assets will be liquidated to pay restitution to your victims. Your name will be added to the Violent Offender Registry. And you will have no contact with your former wife or your biological daughter under any circumstances. Preston's face went white. I hope the next 15 years give you time to reflect on the harm you've caused. But frankly, Mr. Ashford, I doubt you're capable of that kind of self-reflection. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. As Preston was led away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time, looking for Vivian, looking for some acknowledgement, some reaction, some sign that he still mattered. Vivian wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her phone, a photo Catherine had just texted her. Rose, now 6 months old and thriving, had smiled for the first time, a real smile. The kind of smile that made everything else disappear. Vivian smiled back at her phone screen, while Preston Ashford vanished into the corridor that would lead him to prison. She never looked at him again. The aftermath spread through the city's power structure like wildfire. The Ashford name, which had meant privilege and connection for 3 generations, became synonymous with disgrace. Business partners distanced themselves. Society friends pretended they had never been close. The charitable foundations quietly removed the Ashford name from their buildings. Margot Ashford Wellington pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperating with investigators. She received 5 years in federal prison and fled to Europe after her release, where she lived in obscurity until her death a decade later. Harrison Cole served 3 years and emerged a broken man, unemployable and ostracized by the only community he had ever known. And throughout the city, in boardrooms, and country clubs and private gatherings, a story spread about the quiet, retired couple who had destroyed a CEO, about the connections they had that no one knew about what happened when you hurt their daughter. Malcolm and Catherine never confirmed or denied anything. They didn't have to. Some lessons are learned through fear, and the fear of the Mercers became a cautionary tale that would be whispered for years. 1 year later, Vivian stood in the doorway of a small office in a converted warehouse downtown. The space was modest: exposed brick, secondhand furniture, donated computers. But it was hers, built from nothing, filled with purpose. The sign above the door read, "The Rose Foundation." It had taken a year to make it happen. A year of healing and planning and building something new from the ashes of her old life. A year of therapy and recovery and learning to recognize her own strength. The Rose Foundation provided legal resources and support for domestic violence survivors. Free legal consultations, emergency housing referrals, advocacy and accompaniment through the court system. Everything Vivian had needed and couldn't find when she was trapped in Preston's world. The foundation was her way of turning her pain into purpose, her way of ensuring that other women wouldn't face what she had faced alone. Rose Catherine Mercer was 18 months old now. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin. She was learning to walk, taking wobbly steps across the floor of the Mercer family home in Westbrook, delighted by her own mobility. She would never know Preston Ashford, would never learn that her biological father was a monster, would grow up knowing only love and safety and the fierce protection of a family that would die before letting anyone hurt her. Sunday dinner at the Mercer house had become a tradition again. Vivian helped her mother cook, while Malcolm sat on the floor with Rose, building block towers that the toddler delighted in knocking down. The smell of pot roast filled the kitchen. The sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had known too much grief. "Dad?" Vivian said, watching Malcolm make exaggerated sounds of dismay as Rose demolished his latest creation. "I never asked." "What exactly did you do at the CIA?" Malcolm looked up, smiling slightly. "I was an accountant." "You were not an accountant. I was an accountant who occasionally had to handle unusual situations." Vivian laughed. For the first time in years, the sound was free, unguarded. The laugh of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side. Rose toddled over to her mother, arms raised. Vivian scooped her up and held her close. "Your grandpa is being mysterious," she told her daughter. "This is going to be a thing with him. Get used to it." Malcolm's eyes met Catherine's across the room. After 40 years of marriage, words were unnecessary. They had done what they set out to do. Their daughter was safe. Their granddaughter was thriving. The monster who had threatened both of them would spend the next 15 years in a cell. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Not for the years of abuse, not for the baby who arrived early, not for the scars that would never fully heal. But it was something. It was justice. It was a beginning. That night, after Rose was asleep in the nursery that had been Vivian's childhood bedroom, Vivian sat on her parents' porch. The night was warm. Crickets sang in the darkness. The stars were bright enough to see, even this close to the city. Catherine joined her with 2 cups of tea. "You know," Vivian said, "I used to think I was weak." Catherine waited. "That I stayed because I wasn't strong enough to leave. That everything that happened was my fault somehow. That if I had just been smarter or braver or better, I would have seen what he was before it was too late. And now I know it takes incredible strength to survive what he did, to wake up every day and keep going when someone is systematically trying to destroy you, to raise your head and smile and pretend everything is fine, because that's the only way to make it through another day." Vivian looked at her mother. "I wasn't weak, Mom. I was surviving. That's the hardest thing there is." Catherine took her hand. "You were never weak. You were never broken. You were just waiting for the right moment." "What moment?" "The moment you remembered who you were. The moment you decided you deserved better. The moment you chose yourself." Vivian was quiet for a long time. The tea grew cold in her hands. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. "The prison door was unlocked the whole time," she said finally. "I just couldn't see it because he'd convinced me I deserved to be caged. But I never did." She looked at her mother. "No one does." 6 months later, a letter arrived at Vivian's office. It was from the prison. "Preston, requesting visitation rights with Rose." Vivian read the letter once. She noted the careful handwriting, the formal language, the veiled threat hidden in polite words. He wanted access to his daughter. He wanted to maintain some connection to the life he had destroyed. He wanted to remind Vivian that he still existed. She didn't respond. Instead, she took the letter home. She lit a fire in the fireplace of her small apartment. The apartment she had chosen herself, furnished herself, paid for with money she had earned. She fed the letter to the flames and watched it burn. Then she picked up her daughter, held her close, and walked out into the sunlight. The past was over. Preston Ashford was locked away, forgotten, irrelevant. He had no power over her anymore. He had no power over Rose. He had no claim to either of their futures. Some monsters wear suits. They smile for cameras and shake hands with mayors and donate to children's hospitals. They hide in plain sight, protected by money and status and the complicity of people who don't want to see the truth. But monsters can be defeated, not by other monsters, by ordinary people who refuse to look away, by parents who protect their children, by survivors who choose to speak. Vivian Mercer didn't need anyone to save her. She just needed time. Time to see clearly, time to find her voice, time to remember who she was before someone tried to convince her she was nothing. She was never nothing. She was never weak. She was just waiting for the right moment. The moment when she stood up, took her daughter, and walked out of the fire. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, I want to ask you for 3 small things. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We release stories like this every week. Stories that entertain, but also empower. Second, drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever known someone trapped in a situation like Vivian's? What would you tell them if you could? And third, share this video. Send it to a friend. Post it on your timeline. You never know who might be silently struggling, waiting for someone to show them they're not alone. Your support helps us reach more women who need these stories. Together, we're building a community that refuses to look away. Closing statement. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful entertainment with real-life lessons. Every story we create is designed not just to captivate you, but to leave you with something valuable. Wisdom, hope, and the reminder that you are stronger than you know. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of this journey with us.